Okay, hello. I've not done this in 2 years, so I'm starting to get the jitters. It's a bit weird. So thank you very much for coming for a very early morning on a Saturday. I'm going to be talking about something that I am very, very passionate about, which is free and open source software. My name is Tania Allard. My pronouns are she, her, and I wear a lot of hats. So my day-to-day job is co-director of Quantit Labs. It's a non-profit, and our main business or our main purpose is to sustain open source communities and projects. But I also serve as a director for the Python Software Foundation, for PyLadies, and yeah, I'm basically a nerd who loves mechanical keyboards. I have a lot of keyboards that I have been saying that I'm gonna build for months, and of course, they're just still sitting in my drawers. So if you want to talk about anything that isn't there, I'm gonna be around. And this is what I'm gonna be talking about. First, I want to just give a very, very brief history lesson. I know it's like university, high school again, but I'll try and make it entertaining. Then I also want to talk about why open source is so important and popular nowadays in our world of tech, and what we can do to improve its sustainability. And a while ago, I can't remember where I saw this, but I remember seeing someone saying that that a piece of tech or a tool has made it because you don't even have to think about its existence. It's just there. You can't imagine your life without it, and you don't have to think about the practicalities of using it. And I think open source has made it right now, because it is so ingrained in our day-to-day lives that anyone, any folk in the world interacts with open source without even knowing it. Whether you're carrying your smartphone, going onto social media, checking your credit score, reading the news, you're interacting with open source. The world itself, all of our tech stacks are built on open source. And all of this is free and public software. So the advantages of this are many, as you will have seen, and as many of you will have experienced. So I'm going to start with a bit of a history, a bit of background on how open source and free software came to be. Because although it is now the norm and it just lives everywhere, we use it day in and day out. Having free and open source software for many years was not the norm. And to understand why free software and open source software is a thing, we also have to understand why it was needed. I don't know how many of you were born in the 70s or 80s. I certainly remember having a very old computer in my home. And probably the breakwater or a key point in our technology industry was when IBM started building personal computers. As personal computers were about to be rolled out into households, they also needed an OS, right? An operating system for the user to interact with the computer, with the hardware. This is how MS-DOS came to life. So IBM partnered with a small company just over there. At that time, it was like Microsoft, just a couple of geeks, trying to make it into the software industry. That is, by the way, my favorite Microsoft logo. It's just like a rock band. It's the best logo they've ever made. They should have just stuck with that one. But because everything was proprietary at the moment, it meant that you couldn't make any copies because that was infringing the actual terms of the license. You could not redistribute that software, and you could not make modifications. So that was the actual the actual birth of proprietary software. We still have many, many, many pieces of proprietary software. If you're a designer, you more than likely use things like Illustrator. That is proprietary software. You cannot modify it. You cannot resell licenses. You cannot build on top of it. But because of all of this proprietary software that started being distributed in the wild, there was also a counter movement that was rooted in social advocacy, in activism. Folks from the MIT, including Stallman, started questioning why proprietary software was becoming the norm. And they started believing, or they started building a community of people that believed that software should be almost as a fundamental right. People should have access to software by default. So software itself should be free. This led to Stallman and others to release GNU software, which was the very first free operating system, and that led the following year to the birth of the Free Software Foundation. And this was, again, probably the birth of the first open source, like free and open source software community. At the moment, remember I said this was a social advocacy movement. So this was rooted in advocacy. It was rooted in activism. This movement concerned a lot around the ethics and the politics of software and the freedom of it. But things started shifting as companies like Netscape started releasing the source code of the products that they were building. So the conversation started shifting from being an activism and a social advocacy movement into a more pragmatic conversation related to the technology itself and how do you distribute that technology and that code. And that's exactly when folks from Silicon Valley got together and started adopting and using the term open source to refer to pieces of software whose original source code is made public or is made open for folks to build on. So, we talk about free and open source software. We hear about it in the news. We go to GitHub, we go to GitLab. Everyone in Twitter talks about it, especially in October. But you will also find in our software world of ours that the definition of open source software that someone has might not exactly match the one that you have. It's almost as if in the last almost 3 decades, the fundamental values of free and open source software have been passed through a game of telephone. And some of these fundamental values that forged these communities of movements are being forgotten. So in case that you need a refresher, here is your refresher. Free software was born out of activism again. So it is based entirely on 4 freedoms. First of all, or freedom number 0 is run. You can run the software for any purpose, whatever it is that you want to use it, whether it's academic, for-profit, or activism, you can do it. Number 2, you should be able to study the code, how this program was built, how it was made. You're free to redistribute the software, so you can make copies to benefit your neighbors, to share with your community, to share with your teammates. And finally, you should be free to improve that software. If the software that you've been given or the copy that you've been given does not satisfy your needs, or you need to add additional features, make it more secure, more performant, you should be able to do that. These are the 4 freedoms as defined by the Free Software Foundation. And anyone who believes in free software adheres to these freedoms and defend them. The problem is, especially in languages like English, it's very easy to conflate the different meanings of free, and that's something that has been very damaging to our communities. There are a lot of people that say like, oh, is it free as a beer, free as a puppy, free as a bird, whatever. So by conflating the meaning of free, we're also reducing or dismissing those four freedoms. And we're also making a lot of damage to our communities and the people that are sustaining free software. So in many contexts, like many people and many advocates try to use the Spanish words for free, as in libre, instead of as gratis, to make this distinction. So from now on, whenever I talk about free software, I'm referring to free as a verb, like libre. Now, when I talk to people about open source all over the world, colleagues, people in industry, clients, I do find that a lot of people are familiar with those four freedoms. But less people are familiar with the open source definition. And this open source definition is comprised by these 10 characteristics. And they are defended basically by the open source initiative. And a piece of software has to abide by these 10 rules for it to be able to be called open source software. If one of these rules is not complied with, or is not applicable to the software, it's just simply not open source software. It can be something else, but it's not open source software under the OSI, Open Source Initiative definition. Of course, in the last few years, there have been a lot of concerns raised around ethics and what people are using open source software for. Especially because we have a couple of rules there that says, oh, I can't, it doesn't work here. Especially rule number 6 that says, you cannot discriminate against fields of endeavor. But there is now a very big activism movement for people to do an ethical shift again on how we perceive and license open source software. Because there are a lot of, when you start building open source software, you build it probably because of love. Because that was probably something that you needed, and it just so happened that it became popular because others needed that as well. But it also has unexpected consequences. It could be that whatever piece of software you're writing will later be used in defense and therefore war. Can also be used in subsidizing or supporting systemic inequalities in our world, because we know we live in a world that is far from perfect. There is a lot of bias, and all of our systems are not equal and not fair. But the fact that both these movements, the free software and the open source movement, have this very well-defined set of rules and this very well-defined set of values also enables us to build communities. Because if we go by the definition of community, it is a social unit of people who share common values and missions. And this is how all of our open source communities came to be. Although, again, free and open source software communities tend to come in hand and have a lot of these values in common, and a lot of the people that belong to these two communities overlap a lot. For practical purposes, open source relates more to development methodology. It relates more to the pragmatism on how you get software out into the world, maintain it, and use it. And free software still remains as a social movement. Those are the two fundamental differences between these two movements. So, why is this important? Like, I know, probably a lot of you already knew this story, probably a lot of you were familiar with the freedoms and the open source initiative, rules and regulation, well, not rules, but requirements. But it is very important for us to be aware of this and be using the same language when we refer to free and open source software. Because free and open source software relies on us being able to redistribute, modify, share, and use for any field of endeavor and technology. Also, free and open source software has made it exponentially cheaper and easier to build software. Before this big boom of free and open source software, most of the companies will have proprietary software, which meant they needed a big in-house development force, specialized marketing, specialized sale, and of course, the users needed to pay ridiculous amounts in licensing. Sometimes service licensing, per user license, one-time installation, multi-device. Like it actually was a lot. You needed a lot of resources. And because of this, because it's just so much cheaper to start building software, it is so much faster to start building apps and putting your things out in the world, you need less and less people. And it's just so easy to share knowledge. Also, this boom in open source software is what actually boomed the startup industry. Companies like Uber, Airbnb, PayPal, Netlify, all of these startups exist thanks to open source software. Also, for us, the people that build software, the developers, it gives us higher bargaining power. If you develop on an open source software framework or tool, it's fine. You can move from one company to another to bring your knowledge. It doesn't matter if you're using React in one company and React in another company, right? It's the same underlying principles. You're building a software that others have been working on for years, sometimes decades. You don't have to build everything from scratch. So it has allowed folks as well to move careers, to move industries, to move jobs faster. Also, many researchers in the area of free and open source software say that in theory, and I just highlight here, theoretically, open source software has the potential to be more stable and secure. And the reason for this statement is you have a higher number of eyes and hands working on open source software, right? So that means that any big security flaws or bugs or critical hotfixes needed will be sent upstream faster because you have a bigger pool of people that can contribute to that can identify it and submit a patch. And all of these factors and many, many others have overall increased the use and adoption of free and open source software over the last decades. And that is something good. That is something really, really good. Because I have to admit, and I say all the time, the reason why I have a job, the reason why I have a career is thanks to open source software. I have been lucky enough to be able to build a career with and around open source software. But just don't believe these statements. We can go to the GitHub October's report. GitHub has become now one of the bigger developer platforms for us to share our code. Also, it serves some sort of like a social network, weirdly enough. But every year, GitHub releases this October's report around GitHub Universe that is towards the late of October. And the numbers just keep growing and growing. This is from 2021, no, 2020, I believe, maybe. But there is 56 million users of GitHub. Like, that is a lot of developers in the world. Those are a lot of people using software. If we look at the distribution, of course, there is a bias towards the global north. But that, again, is because of how our systems and like our human systems are built. But over the last couple of reports, we've seen a consistent growth in other areas and in the global south. Africa's developer population has been growing and growing and growing consistently, probably not at the same rate as it's growing in Europe or in the US. But this is, again, thanks to free and open source software. If we look again at from a different angle, this distribution, we do see that there is some countries or some areas that that have like these big clusters of developers, this big high population or numbers of developers. But this trend is replicating in other continents. It's replicating in other countries. So we all know, like, free and open source software has grown. All the companies use some sort of open source software, whether it is front-end, back-end, data science, infrastructure, DevOps, security, network, accessibility, whatever you call it, you're using some sort of open source. And it's great. I've already said, like, the startup industry is booming thanks to free and open source software. It's a great thing. I love to see open source software outside in the world. I want to see more of it. The problem, remember, is that conflating of the terms or the meanings of the word free. That is something very important, because it wasn't until 2016, that Nadia Iqbal, together with the Ford Foundation, published this 142 pages report called Roads and Bridges, the Unseen Labor Behind Open Digital Infrastructure. And these 142 pages sheds a very important light on the people that are building this infrastructure, the state of critical projects, like pretty much holding the technological infrastructure as of now. But what was surprising is that a lot of companies, a lot of people using all of these tools for profit had no idea that this is mostly run by volunteers, that we rely on the goodwill of good folk spending their nights or their free time, that get burnout. So in a world driven by technology, like Nadia likes saying, we are putting increased demand on the people that maintain our digital infrastructure. And here I would like to ask a question. Who likes paying taxes? Who's okay with paying taxes? I'm okay with paying taxes. I don't like paying taxes, but I am well aware, and we are all aware, that when we pay taxes, that pays for trash collection, sewage, highways, motorways. The only reason why I was able to drive from Manchester here is thanks to taxes and public infrastructure. So taxes is a good thing, right? Like it goes to a central person, government organization. Then that organization decides how it is best to disburse those funds, and we have public infrastructure. In the world of open source, this open infrastructure is from the bottom up. We don't have one single organization or one single body where we say, hey, here is my money, or here are my taxes, or here is my time, or my knowledge. Now go and disburse those in the areas that need it the most. It would be lovely if there was something like that, but there isn't. So, because the lack of this formalization around free and open source infrastructure, prioritization, and resources allocation, it is just so easy to see that things are working without actually thinking how they are working. But this report that Nadia released in 2016 helped open the eyes of a lot of people. But what do we like doing as software developers? Like, what are the things that we do when we find a problem? Well, we go down to our zone of comfort and start building software. So in response to this, and in response to the sustainability crisis in free and open source software, we have seen a massive growth in websites, platforms, and basically software for you to be able to send money or provide some sort of funding to this critical open source project. Things like Mozilla open source support grants, the Chan Zuckerberg initiative grants for essential open source software, GitHub sponsors, Open Collective, and many, many, many more. Now that crypto is a thing, there are, you bet, people doing crypto bounties, crypto crowdfunding to support open source. But once again, we as humans, we as software developers, we as business people like to conflate things. The problem with open source goes far beyond from money. But we keep, because of how we've grown, because of the ecosystem that we've been born, grown, and we live in, we tend to simulate a lot because of our culture and experience, and we're conditioned to equate money with stability and sustainability. And that's again what is happening. It is a great intention that we're building all of these apps to send money to open source software projects and communities. But I used to travel a whole lot. I talked to a lot of open source developers. A lot of the people that work with me in my company are open source developers. We hire them to work on open source. One of the problems that some of these open source core developers had was they started getting money from companies, individuals, organizations, initiatives. But once that the money got in there, they had to start thinking about taxes, hoops that they had to go through to pay their volunteers. It's not straightforward in many countries to take the funds that are in an open collective, then change from US dollars to their local currency, pay taxes, and then register themselves into whatever fiscal system they have. The second problem was they didn't know what to spend the money in, because that money just came with no planning, with no resources. So if you're a team of 2 people that have a full-time job, a family, and you kind of get a couple of hours here and there to maintain software or like critical infrastructure, a lot of these people are in survival mode for the project. They don't have long-term sustainability roadmaps. Sometimes they don't even have governance structure. If one of these people leaves the project, wins the lottery, gets hit by a boss, there is no succession planning. So sustainability, like money in open source software, does not equate sustainability. And the many, many problems that we face in open source go beyond just funding, just beyond resources. There is a lot of volunteer burnout, a lot. Many, many of my friends, people I know, people in my communities have left entire industries because of burnout. There is a lot of community mismanagement. I have seen hundreds of times a lot of community folks or folks that want to get involved in open source projects, and they just leave because gatekeeping, because there is always an entitled toxic person in the project, and it's much more worth for the project itself to keep those folks around than building a safe community for all. There is lack of governance. Many open source software projects started, as I said, as a labor of love, as something that someone needed. And then it just so happened that the project became popular. People started using it, and now, like, whoever developed that originally has the burden of maintaining it, nurturing, has become a community leader, has to reply to issues, check pull requests, onboard folks, mentor folks, write documentation, disperse funds. But they have no prior training in community management. They know nothing about laws. So there is a formal lack in governance. And although projects are also getting money through crowdfunding, there are many critical pieces of software that need very large pieces of funding, like to actually make them more modern, more secure, more performant. It's really, really hard to make a case for maintenance or long-term support of software when you're getting money from the government, academic grants and such. Most of this money will go towards innovation, because that's a word we all like. Academics like innovation. Entrepreneurs like innovation. So justifying that you're gonna do essential long-term maintenance of a code base that is built on Fortran 77 and you want to bring it onto Fortran not even 2003, 92, it's hard to make a case because it works. Why fix it? It works. So this is a tweet from a very good friend of mine, Chris Holgraf. He's a nerd as well. That's why he's such a good friend of mine. But I think he hit the nail there by saying that this image of a person, like single person, single-handed, trying, like getting all of this tension from two very different pieces, whether it is industry and community, clients and community, funding for innovation or for critical maintenance, is a constant struggle that maintainers are always under. So I think I've established now that free and open source software sustainability is a very complex problem. There is not one easy solution. It's not like if I had $50 million, I can't just throw it at it and it'll make it better. So yeah, I think now I don't need to say it's a complex problem. So how do we tackle the sustainability problems? There is a reason why so many companies and corporations invest in corporate sustainability programs. Because the long term of sustainability, it is not to carry on improving, but also planning for succession and opening new opportunities for folks in the future to build upon. So here are 3 elements for free and open source of sustainability. These elements are intertwined and cannot be separated. You cannot tackle one without tackling the other 2. Each one has to be addressed by each person and each organization if we want free and open source software to be sustainable. So let me go to the basics, contributing back. A lot of us do that on a daily basis. There are, as an individual, 3 things, or even as a corporation, 3 things that you can contribute with. Time, money, expertise. Then what we also need to care about, like another essential, is human and environmental diversity. First, geo-distribution, or like geographical distribution. There's still a lot of work that can be done there. But also, if we think about that map that I showed you for those numbers, in which the 2%, like only 2% of the developer population, just by doing a proxy, is located in Africa. And the numbers in the global south are much lower than the north and south, than the global north. It means that there is something just like fostering that inequity. Then we have to start thinking, what is that? We just assume that, again, everyone speaks English by default, which is not the case. Like, most of our programming languages are originated from the English language. Resources, documentation, tutorials, videos, most of them are in English. So we have to make a better effort in translation and localization. I know a lot of people are like, well, it's just as easy to go and learn Python or Rust online as it is to go and learn English. You could argue that. But again, how does a person that has a full-time job, children, carrying responsibilities, trying to change careers, and that's why they're learning to program, also has time to learn English so that they can learn to program, so that they can get a job that will pay for the basic needs of their families? Second, tools. I'm not going to go into details or like Vim is better, whatever. But also, we have to account that people use a diversity of tools. In the FOSS community, there is also bias. Like, if someone comes and say, hey, X library or X package doesn't run well on Windows, a lot of maintainers are going to be like, I don't care. It's not my problem. Get Microsoft to solve it, or you do it. But again, by limiting, like, people sometimes don't get to choose what tools they use. If we don't cater for the tools that people might be using, people in other countries are usually, they don't have access to the latest technology, latest computers, all of that. So we also have to account for all of that diversity of tools, because that also brings the diversity of people. One of the most talented software developers that I've worked with is Steve Dower. He's one of the core Python maintainers. He works at Microsoft. And he is the absolute expert of Python on Windows. It's amazing. And over the last couple of years, He and many others have made such a great effort to make the Python experience on Windows as smooth and smooth sailing as possible. And that has opened the doors for many students and many people to start interacting with the open source world. And last but not least, community safety. You can contribute your talent, you can run security audits, provide design services, but if you don't invest in making your community a safe place for everyone, that's not gonna stick. In many cases, people leave toxic people, not projects. Like the same as in a company. A lot of people leave toxic companies because of the people, not because they don't like the technology stack. Well, some do, I've done it, but you get me. It's more about the people. And it is important to recognize that these three essential items are equally important. They're equally valid methods to support the project. Many people can only spare money. It's fine. Many people can only spare expertise in a certain area. That's fine. So something very important, again, is you as a maintainer, as a core maintainer of a project, you have to recognize that everyone has constraints because you have them yourself. But we should pay equal attention to these three items of sustainability. So this brings us to how can we reimagine the sustainability of the open source world? First, we can start by calculating the actual costs of open source sustainability. You say, hey, Tania, how do we do that? It depends. That is my answer, it depends. I don't have a straightforward formula. If I had one, my job would be so much easier. But this is a proxy. You can think in terms of direct and indirect costs for you, for your team, for your company. Let's think about direct costs. Bugs and security flaws that need immediate action so that you don't lose business, so that you don't expose your client's data, so that you're not sued because you're not adhering to GDPR. Indirect costs are normally, let's say, in a team, related to the loss of labor, because people sometimes need to move to other places that are actually giving them time and space to work on their open source projects. If you don't adopt open source software and you go down the route of proprietary software, well, you're looking at slower growth and innovation. And this indirect cost usually represent uncaptured social value as well. So you have to balance and account for all of this direct costs and indirect costs, as I said, individual, team, company. The easiest way is doing an audit, and I say the easiest way is doing an audit of all the open source projects that you, your team, your company relies on. Identify those ones that are critical, whether it is OpenSSL, Kubernetes, Docker, Python, Rust, Node, whatever it is, and identify the most pressing gaps as well that these projects have right now. So that is the step number one in developing an open source sustainability strategy that actually works for your team. So I said, determine what projects are critical. Evaluate the longevity needs of the project and their gaps. Once you have identified that project, or the project that is the most strategic for you to deliver value in whatever industry, company you are, talk to the community. This is a very crucial part. Talk to the community to understand what they need. What is the skill that they are the shortest on? What is that they really need to fix? Do they need legal advice? Do they need design? Do you need accessibility consultancy? What do they need? Do they need a security expert? The key is that you as an individual or as a team or a company, you cannot just assume that you know what is needed and throw one or two resources or money and assume that that's going to fix the problem. Collaborate with the project, the community, to find the right type of support. Contribute, listen, engage, and participate continuously. I have seen, again, times and times again, very well-intentioned folks that engage very poorly. It is the first interaction with an open source project. Probably they care about the project, it's a critical project for them, and they want to make it better. And their very first interaction is say hey, the underlying format of this tool is wrong. Why didn't you choose this, that? You should change it. How is that going to sit with the community, with a maintainer? Probably the intention was a good intention, right? But probably things are the way they are because they have many other constraints in terms of architecture, resources, security, governance, direction, road mapping. It takes time. Building a proper open source sustainability plan takes time. As any other corporate sustainability project takes time. It cannot be rushed. You cannot take shortcuts. You have to build trust with the community because you have to contribute, listen, engage, and participate. And that takes time. Because access in the open world, whether it's open science, open source software, open education, access is not just about reading, but also being able to make decisions, have a voice and shape the direction, economic models, and infrastructure. So we all have this power within the open source software and free software communities and ecosystems. But for us to exercise this voice and this power of shaping the direction, we have to first listen, communicate, and engage. As a company, there are many things and initiatives that you can start building towards your open source sustainability plan. What are things that are always present in companies that are not necessarily present in open source projects? Admin skills, administrative support, folks that don't know how to do taxes because their employer does that for them, folks that don't know how to disperse these open collected funds to their volunteers across the world, fiscal sponsorship, corporate programs, improving relationships between projects and external stakeholders. You as a company, for us, a side of our organization is a consultancy. One of the main advantages of having a consultancy side of things is that we actually see how our clients are intending to use the open source software that our folks build, maintain, and love. So we are actually identifying, working directly with these clients to see what their pain points are and build the plan to fix those. And increasing support of diverse skills and non-coding functions. This is super important. We have been paying too much importance and putting so much emphasis on coding is the prime and the first contribution you should do to an open source project. If you have design skills, any project would be, most of the open source projects will be happy to have you, or have a few hours of your expertise to make their sites better, their apps more accessible, their documentation better, their logo better, making sure that everything is colorblind friendly and friendly for neurodivergent folks. As an individual, again, I've said there are three things that you can give: talent, time, and money. So, this is the company that I'm the co-director for. This is Quanti Labs, and we have been trying to build that open source sustainability plan since the inception of the company. That's actually the reason Quanti Labs exists. We are, to start with, a non-profit division, which means that we can also apply for grants. Like recently, we got a NASA ROSES grant, so we're going to be supporting critical infrastructure for data and numerical work for the next 3 years. About 40% of the total money that we got for the grant is to build community and governance practices. We provide all of these skills that are rare to find in open source. We have developers, community managers, designers, documentation writers, an accessibility expert. We are now, one of the projects that I'm the most excited about is an accessibility project. You can say, well, Quantsite works in the machine learning space. How does accessibility fit in? One of the premises of open source software is making it available to the public, right? You're aiming, and also free software aims to make software or tech more equitable, democratize tech and learning for all. You cannot uphold to those standards if what you're building is not accessible by all. If you only focus on abled users, then you're disregarding the experience and negating many opportunities for folks that are not fully abled. So as a company, we do tackle these parts. Administrative support, we provide fiscal sponsorship through NonFocus. For every hour that our developers work unpaid in open source projects affiliated through NonFocus, we make a donation every month. Like, that's per hour spent on each developer. Community work orders. This is something very interesting. We have all of these clients that use open source software and open source tools. It's in their best interest to patch bugs, security fixes, or making sure that the releases are done in time and form. They don't have the buy-in in the community. They don't have the developers. So they sponsor developers through us. That means that they're not employed by our client, but they are given dedicated time and resources and access to other skills in both companies to be able to work on the roadmap and the features for those projects. We hire, mentor, and support not only existing leaders, but emerging leaders in the open source software. This is critical for succession and long-term sustainability. We have also a number of grants aimed at solely improving the contributor experience through documentation, mentorship, and onboarding processes in the scientific computing ecosystem. And we guarantee time and resources for open source maintainers and core devs. Whether that is coming from community work orders or whether that's coming from our pockets as an organization. I'm going to say it works because we have grown our team a lot. I joined the company in January, and there has not been 1 month that we've not been able to hire 1 or 2 open source developers. Hopefully by now, I will have convinced you that it is worth supporting open source, building a personal team or company open source sustainability initiative. Remember, it takes time and commitment. It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of commitment. So why would you do it? You will have more reliable products and supply chain. You will foster collaboration between groups, understand your clients and customers. If your teammates have not to only submit pull requests within your company, but to open source projects, I guarantee you they're gonna get better at communicating. Like, they have to get better at communicating. And improve retention and recruiting. As an individual, open source is a very good way to build reputation. Again, if you have the time, resources, and privilege to devote time to open source as an individual contributor. You can create new opportunities for yourself and for others. If all you can do is mentor others, you're making new opportunities for folks that are entering the industry or the community. You're supporting emerging markets. Open source, free and open source software is an emerging market. If you go at the definition of emerging market, FOSS is an emerging market. And you increase tech equity and democratization. And it is so, so worth it. I have had, my journey in open source started because I felt as an outsider in my PhD. And since then, I have gone through periods of, I've been burned out, I found the dream of my life, my job of my life, and my dream job. I've made friends, had mentors, have traveled the world, and I get to work on something that I deeply care about with folks that deeply care about the same things. So I don't think I would change all the time that I've spent in open source. Of course, I've experienced the good and the bad. There have been times in which I've had such bad interaction with the community that all I could do was go home and cry. But those are the things that, make those sweet moments, or the impact, or when you see folks making their first contribution, become community leaders, onboard others, that makes it worth it. I'm not endorsing burnout or mistreating of your volunteers. But we can change that. We have the power to exercise that voice in making decisions and setting the direction of open source in our communities. And on that note, October is probably one of my favorite months. One is witchy season. I love everything Halloween related, but it's also Hacktoberfest. And I was so delighted to see when I was looking at the Hacktoberfest events that there was a in-person Hacktoberfest corner here. I've not sat and sprinted in person with real people in 2 years. I used to do that every day, probably, but Oktoberfest is one of my favorite months because you get to actually give a tiny bit back to all of those projects that have given you and our community and our society too much. So go check it out. Go, if you want to submit a pull request or engage with open source folks, go check out the corner. I am not there, but I know like some amazing folk that are going to be running that bit. And thank you. I hope that this helped you think a bit differently about open source sustainability and what we can do better for our community.